In the final months of the Pacific War, the skies over Japan no longer felt distant or unreachable. For decades, Japan's island geography had been considered a natural shield, a barrier that foreign powers could never easily cross. Yet by 1945, that belief had collapsed. What Japanese civilians and military commanders witnessed was something no nation had ever faced before. Massive formations of American B-29 Superfortress bombers, flying higher, farther, and in greater numbers than any bomber force in history. To understand why the sight of 279 American B-29s dropping more than 1,600 tons of bombs convinced many in Japan that the end was near, we must begin years earlier, long before a single bomb fell on Tokyo. The story starts with American industrial planning, strategic foresight, and a war effort that was already thinking several moves ahead. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, American military planners understood that defeating Japan would not be quick or easy. Japan controlled vast territories across the Pacific, and its homeland was far beyond the reach of conventional bombers. Early in the war, the United States simply did not possess an aircraft capable of striking Japan directly while carrying a meaningful bomb load. That reality shaped everything that followed. The solution came in the form of an ambitious aircraft program that many initially believed was unrealistic. The B-29 Superfortress was not just another bomber. It was a leap into the future. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, long-range fuel capacity, and an unprecedented payload made it unlike anything else in the sky. But this technological leap came at a cost. The B-29 program became the most expensive weapons project of the war, costing more than the Manhattan Project. While Japanese intelligence knew America was building new bombers, they underestimated both the scale and the speed of American production. The assumption was that even if such aircraft existed, they would be produced in small numbers and take years to become operational. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. By 1944, American factories were producing B-29s at a rate Japan could not comprehend. Entire assembly lines stretched for miles. Thousands of workers labored around the clock, building aircraft faster than Japanese planners believed possible. Each bomber represented not just metal and engines, but an industrial system that Japan had no answer for. The first American attempts to bomb Japan using B-29s were difficult and costly. Flying from bases in China presented enormous logistical challenges. Fuel, bombs, and spare parts had to be flown over the Himalayas, a route so dangerous it became known as the hump. Losses were high, and results were limited. To Japanese commanders, this seemed to confirm their belief that American long-range bombing would never be decisive. But everything changed with the capture of the Mariana Islands. When American forces seized Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in 1944, the strategic balance shifted overnight. These islands were close enough to Japan to allow round-trip bombing missions, and they could support massive airfields. Almost immediately, construction began on a scale never before seen. Entire runways appeared in weeks. Fuel storage tanks, repair depots, and barracks spread across the islands. Japan watched helplessly as a giant air armada took shape just beyond its reach. By early 1945, the B-29 campaign against Japan intensified dramatically. At first, American bombers attempted high-altitude precision bombing. The idea was to destroy factories and infrastructure with minimal civilian casualties. But Japan's weather, jet streams, and dispersed industry made this approach less effective than hoped. Bombs drifted off target. Clouds obscured factories. Results were inconsistent. American commanders adapted. They made a decision that would change the course of the war and shock Japan to its core. B-29s would fly lower at night, and they would carry incendiary bombs instead of high explosives. Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, were terrifyingly vulnerable to fire. When the first massive firebombing raids struck Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, the destruction was beyond anything Japan had ever experienced. Entire neighborhoods vanished in hours. Firestorms consumed oxygen, suffocating those who tried to hide. Civil defense collapsed. Firefighters were overwhelmed. Roads filled with refugees fleeing flames that moved faster than people could run. For Japanese civilians, the psychological impact was devastating. For the military leadership, it was worse. They now understood that American bombers could appear in overwhelming numbers, night after night, with little effective opposition. Japanese fighter aircraft struggled to intercept the B-29s. The bombers flew too high for many fighters, and when flying low at night, radar and coordination were inadequate. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but it was scattered and ineffective against formations this large. Each raid revealed the same brutal truth. Japan could not stop what was coming. Then came the raids involving hundreds of bombers at once. On nights when the skies filled with the deep, rumbling sound of hundreds of engines, it became impossible to deny reality. When 279 B-29s dropped more than 1,600 tons of bombs in a single operation, it was not just a military strike. It was a demonstration of overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority. 4 Japanese officers watching cities burn. The numbers told a story they could no longer ignore. This was not a one-time effort. America could repeat these raids again and again. Each lost bomber was replaced. Each destroyed city could not be rebuilt under constant attack. Fuel shortages, food shortages, and transportation breakdowns spread across the country. Inside Japan's leadership circles, quiet admissions began to surface. Even those who publicly called for resistance understood privately that the situation was becoming hopeless. The question was no longer whether Japan could win, but how long it could endure. The B-29s became symbols of inevitability. They represented an enemy whose resources seemed endless, whose factories never stopped, and whose reach extended into the heart of the empire. Every raid eroded morale, not just among civilians, but within the military itself. By mid-1945, when Japanese observers saw hundreds of American bombers approaching in daylight or darkness, many already knew what it meant. This was not a temporary phase of the war. This was the beginning of the end. And yet, the worst was still to come. Survivors described winds so powerful they knocked people off their feet, sucking oxygen from the air and pulling human beings into burning streets they could not escape. Rivers filled with bodies. Shelters became ovens. Night itself became the enemy. Inside Japanese military headquarters, reports grew darker by the week. Ammunition stockpiles vanished faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft factories were destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. Fuel shortages grounded planes before they ever reached the runway. The numbers told a brutal story. America was producing bombers, bombs, and fuel faster than Japan could destroy them. Japanese pilots who survived interception attempts began to speak openly among themselves. They were not facing an enemy that could be worn down. They were facing an enemy that multiplied. For every bomber shot down, dozens more appeared in the next raid. For every damaged factory, American intelligence already had a new target list. Civilians noticed the change before politicians admitted it. Food grew scarce. Cities emptied as people fled to the countryside. Children were evacuated from urban centers. Schools closed. Factories filled with women, elderly men, and teenagers, all working under the knowledge that the bombers would return. And they always did. Even hardened officers, men trained never to show doubt, began to understand what the numbers meant. 279 bombers in a single raid. Over 1,600 tons of explosives in one night. This was not harassment. This was annihilation by arithmetic. Japan could not replace what was being destroyed. America could. By mid-1945, the question inside Japan was no longer whether defeat was coming. It was how much suffering would occur before it arrived. The B-29s had turned the war into something unavoidable, something visible in every burning city and every shattered factory. Each raid pushed the nation closer to collapse, not through one decisive blow, but through endless repetition. When Japanese survivors later spoke of that night, they rarely mentioned strategy or politics. They spoke of the sound, the endless droning overhead. The moment they realized the bombs were not stopping. The moment they understood that no defense remained. In that realization, many said they knew the end was near. By the time the American B-29 campaign reached its full intensity, the psychological impact on Japan was already as devastating as the physical destruction. Civilians who had once believed their homeland was untouchable now lived under a constant expectation of fire from the sky. Every clear night became a source of fear. Every distant engine sounded a possible omen of annihilation. Japanese air defense units were stretched beyond their limits. Radar coverage was inconsistent. Fighter response times were slow, and fuel shortages crippled what remained of the interceptor force. Pilots who scrambled to meet the B-29s often climbed desperately, knowing their aircraft struggled to reach the bombers' cruising altitude. Even when contact was made, the odds were brutally against them. The Superfortress flew higher, faster, and in tighter formations than anything Japan had prepared to face. Inside the cities, life changed permanently. Blackout curtains became mandatory. Families slept in clothes, ready to flee at the sound of sirens. Buckets of water were kept by doors, though everyone knew they were useless against incendiary storms. School children were evacuated to the countryside, while factories dispersed into homes, temples, and caves. Japan was no longer fighting a conventional war. It was fighting for survival against an industrial force that seemed limitless. When 279 B-29s appeared in the sky during major raids, the scale alone shattered morale. Japanese observers described the bombers as an endless river of metal, stretching from horizon to horizon. The sound was not individual engines, but a single, overwhelming roar that drowned out all other noise. It was at this moment many officers realized the war had entered a phase Japan could not recover from. The bombs themselves were not merely explosives. They were instruments of systemic collapse. Power stations vanished in seconds. Transportation hubs burned uncontrollably. Factories that had taken decades to build were erased in minutes. Each raid dropped more tonnage than entire bombing campaigns earlier in the war. The figure, 1,665 tons in a single operation, was almost impossible for Japanese planners to comprehend. Even more alarming was what followed. The raids did not slow down. They increased. Night after night, waves of bombers returned with mechanical precision. There was no pause, no negotiation, no mercy in the schedule. America's ability to replace aircraft, crews, and bombs faster than Japan could repair damage or train pilots created a crushing asymmetry. Japanese military leaders began to confront an unthinkable truth. This was not a temporary setback. It was a demonstration of overwhelming production power. For every bomber lost, several more appeared. For every factory destroyed in Japan, dozens operated uninterrupted in the United States. The war had become a contest of economies, and Japan was being buried under the weight of American industry. Survivor accounts from Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka speak of firestorms that turned night into day. Streets melted, rivers boiled with refugees seeking escape from flames. Entire neighborhoods vanished so completely that maps had to be redrawn. Firefighters could do nothing but watch as winds created by the inferno fed the destruction. Within military headquarters, reports became increasingly grim. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled. Aircraft maintenance crews lacked spare parts. Pilots flew missions knowing there would be no replacement aircraft if theirs was damaged. Confidence eroded rapidly, replaced by resignation. Japanese leaders understood that the B-29 campaign was not about single battles. It was about erasing Japan's ability to continue the war. Each bomb dropped was another calculation in America's favor. The question was no longer whether Japan could win, but how long it could endure. Even Emperor Hirohito was briefed on the extent of the devastation. Advisors admitted that continued resistance would only multiply civilian suffering. The American strategy was clear: force a decision by demonstrating that resistance was futile against such scale and precision. As the raids continued, whispers spread among civilians and soldiers alike. The war was lost, not because of a single defeat, but because the enemy could do this every night, endlessly. Japan had no answer to the sky filled with bombers. By the end of these massive raids, the realization was unavoidable. When hundreds of B-29s could strike at will, delivering thousands of tons of destruction in one night, the end was not approaching. It had already arrived. Japan was witnessing the closing chapter of the war, written in fire and steel from the sky. By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer fighting a war of strategy. It was fighting time itself. What Japanese civilians, soldiers, and officials witnessed in the skies that year was unlike anything in human history. When hundreds of American B-29 Superfortresses appeared at once, flying higher than most fighters could reach, it became impossible to deny the truth any longer. This was not just bombing. This was industrial annihilation delivered from the sky. Each B-29 carried more bombs than entire squadrons had dropped earlier in the war. When 279 bombers released over 1,600 tons of explosives in a single mission, Japanese observers realized something terrifying. America was not running out of aircraft, fuel, pilots, or bombs. It was accelerating. Factories vanished in minutes. Rail yards burned through the night. Entire city blocks were reduced to ash before fire crews could even respond. Survivors described the sound not as explosions, but as a continuous roar, like the sky itself tearing apart. Japanese air defenses tried everything. Fighters climbed until engines choked. Anti-aircraft guns fired until barrels glowed red. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was counted drop by drop. Meanwhile, American crews returned, refueled, rearmed, and flew again. That imbalance crushed morale faster than the bombs destroyed buildings. Reports sent to Tokyo became increasingly desperate. Commanders admitted they could not stop the raids. Civil defense officials admitted evacuation plans were meaningless. Industrial ministers admitted production targets were fantasies. Even hardened officers began writing words once unthinkable in Imperial Japan. "We cannot endure this pace." The people knew it too. When air raid sirens sounded, there was no panic anymore, only resignation. Families sat together in silence. knowing shelters offered little protection against firestorms. Many did not even run. They simply waited. The bombing of Japan was not just about destruction. It was about inevitability. America demonstrated something no nation had ever shown before: the ability to sustain overwhelming force without pause. Day after day, night after night, week after week, Japan had fought fiercely, brilliantly, and with immense sacrifice. But sacrifice could not compete with assembly lines that never stopped, oil fields that never ran dry, and skies filled endlessly with aluminum and fire. When the final missions came, long before surrender was announced, many Japanese officers already knew the war was finished. The question was no longer how to win. It was how much more their country would lose before it ended. The B-29s did not just bomb Japan into submission. They erased the illusion that Japan could continue at all. And when the engines faded into the distance, leaving burning cities behind, one truth was undeniable. The end was no longer approaching. It had already arrived.